Hello, and welcome to an introduction to human trafficking for service providers. This webinar was created by the Human Trafficking Initiative of Metropolitan Family Services. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at trafficking@metrofamily.org or give us a call at 312-986-4000. With this webinar, we would like to accomplish the following objectives: to identify what is human trafficking and its intersection with other issues, to recognize the indicators of trafficking, and to determine the remedies for survivors and how to refer or assist them. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. It is the exploitation of a person for the purpose of compelled labor or a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Compelled labor or labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting that person to labor trafficking, which can be involuntary servitude, or peonage, or debt bondage, or slavery. Anne's story is one of the many ways of how it can happen. Anne was smuggled into the U.S. from Thailand. She was promised legal immigration status and a job. She was set up with a job at a restaurant, but her smuggler did not obtain immigration papers for her. Anything Anne earned working at the restaurant went directly to her smuggler. Anne was forced to work 14-hour days with only a 5-minute break per day to eat. She and other employees were housed in the restaurant, sharing one small room. And when she complained, the manager hit her and told her he would have her deported if she complained again. When she told the smuggler, he said that if she tried to escape, he would kill her parents back home. So there are many incidents here of force, fraud, and coercion asserted upon Anne that makes her case of worker abuse elevate to a case of labor trafficking. This slide helps explain this further. In October 2014, the Urban Institute released a report on labor trafficking based on research it conducted with Northeastern University. Based on interviews with 122 labor trafficking survivors, the report mapped out their experiences, and the number of survivors had experienced the same incidents of worker abuse and exploitation even if they were in various industries. This list that shows a spectrum from light blue that is identified as labor exploitation to dark blue that is identified as labor trafficking illustrates this intersection between exploitation and trafficking within the patterns of worker abuse. However, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, and although the light blue areas are indicated to be forms of exploitation and not trafficking, this is not to be taken as a hard and fast rule. As we can see, 90% of those who were interviewed experienced 8 or more forms of victimization, all across the spectrum from light blue to dark blue. And 94% of the workers were aware that they were being abused, with immigration status as a powerful form of control that made it difficult for them to leave their situation. Now, in terms of sex trafficking, which is the exploitation of a person for the purpose of providing commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, a commercial sex act needs to be defined. We need to emphasize that a commercial sex act pertains to anything of value, not just money, that is used in exchange for the sex act. And that is how a sex act becomes a commercial sex act. Again, it does not need to be money. It can be the promise to do or not do something, or in exchange for a favor, or in exchange for goods or services. And this does not need to come into the hands of the victim as well. So, for example, A case that happened in the U.S. involved parents who offered their car salesman to have sex with their 14-year-old daughter instead of paying car installment payments. So here, the Sex Act became the Commercial Sex Act because the car installment payments were used in exchange for sex. And a third person, namely the child's parents, benefited from the Child Sex Act with the car salesman. I'd like to point out a few distinctions that are important for victims of sex trafficking who are minors. First of all, when the victim of sex trafficking is a minor or anyone who is under the age of 18, he or she does not need to show that there are elements of force, fraud, or coercion in the case of providing sex acts. So, even if a child agrees to engage in sex acts and a third person benefits from the act, the child is still considered a victim. Just like in our previous case, even if the daughter agreed to have sex with a car salesman, she would still be considered a victim because of her age. Moreover, under federal law, sex trafficking of minors can be committed in two ways, through commercial sex acts or through child pornography. Illinois law adds a third, through sexually explicit performances as well. Now, if you are a mandated reporter in Illinois, take note that the Illinois Abused and Neglected Child Reporting Act requires the mandated reporter to report to the Department of Children and Family Services, or DCFS, when there is a suspected case of child abuse, which may involve child abuse, neglect, labor trafficking, or sex trafficking. This is pursuant to the Illinois Safe Children's Act, a law that was passed in 2010. It is the same law that provides immunity from prosecution of the crime of prostitution if the person is under 18. The child will not be charged and will be referred to DCFS to help the child with his or her safety needs. So what exactly constitutes force, fraud, or coercion? Force pertains to the use of actual physical force or restraint upon the trafficking victim. So these are examples such as physical isolation, linguistic isolation, or social isolation. It could be assault, such as sexual assault or physical assault, and the like. Fraud pertains to lies or misrepresentations to trick or defraud. So promises made to the victim to marry the victim, or the promises of love or promises of support, the promises of certain working conditions, the promises of certain pay or benefits, debt bondage, or confiscating the victim's identification documents, and it doesn't matter whether these identification documents are real or fake. And also, coercion pertains to the threats of harm or threats to abuse the legal process. So this is where a lot of the psychological force can come in, such as the threats to deport the victim, threats of harm to the victim, or threats of harm to the co-workers or family of the victim. This also includes actual harm done to those surrounding the victim, such as co-workers or family of the victim, in order to psychologically coerce the victim to remain or stay in the trafficking situation. Threats to arrest or report the authorities. The confiscation of the victim's identification or other documents, such as financial documents, is a form of coercion as well. This is a power and control wheel. Trafficking happens because force, fraud, and coercion, which essentially is power and control, is asserted upon the victims. This is a good way to illustrate the forms or incidents of power and control that controllers or traffickers have used in past cases. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a good list of ways to show how manipulation has happened in the past or in past cases. So for instance, examples of force we can find under isolation, such as denies access to children, family, or friends, doesn't allow the victim to learn English, keeps the victim confined, or accompanies them to public places. More examples are under sexual abuse, such as forces the victim to have sex with multiple people, or uses rape against the victim as a weapon or means of control, or normalizes sexual violence and selling sex. Examples of fraud can be found under minimizing, denying, and blaming, such as making light of the abuse or situation, or denying that anything illegal is occurring, or even placing the blame on victim for the trafficking situation. Using privilege is another way to help perpetuate the fraud and either recruit the victim into the trafficking situation or enable that cycle of abuse, such as treating the victim like a servant or defining gender roles to make them subservient, using nationality to suggest superiority or credibility, using certain victims to control other victims, or hiding or destroying important papers. And lastly, coercion and threats and intimidation both show ways that coercion and threat can be used as a form of psychological force and control over the victim, such as the threat to do physical harm, or the threat to harm the family, or the threat to shame the victim, or the threat to report the victim to the police or immigration. Also, the actual harm or killing of others to show force, or the display or use of weapons, or destroying property, or harming the children of the victim, or lying about police involvement in the trafficking situation. So who can be a victim? Anyone can be a victim. Victims can be citizens or non-citizens, men or women, adults or children, strangers, friends, family members, or neighbors of the trafficker, and from various socioeconomic groups or various educational attainments as well. So for instance, we have had clients who have ranged from either high school graduates all the way to college graduates. And for traffickers, it can be anyone as well. They can be U.S. citizens or non-citizens, men or women, adults or children, strangers, friends, family, or colleagues of the victim, and they may or may not be of the same ethnic origin or nationality as the victim and may come from various socioeconomic groups, and also from various educational attainments as well, such as traffickers have been found to have either postgraduate degrees or college degrees or high school degrees. It's important to emphasize that human trafficking is different from smuggling. Smuggling is considered a crime against the state and involves movement, specifically the transportation of foreign citizens into the U.S. with a deliberate evasion of U.S. immigration laws. Trafficking, however, is considered a crime against persons, as defined under U.S. Illinois law, and involves exploitation. So it may happen to both citizens and non-citizens, and it does not require movement. Many victims were born and raised in Illinois and trafficked in Illinois. However, smuggling can evolve into trafficking, just like in Anne's story in the previous slide. The fact of being smuggled is used by controllers against trafficking victims like Anne to keep them in their trafficking situation. But smuggling does not negate their status as trafficking victims and their ability to seek legal or immigration relief to escape the trafficking situation. That said, however, trafficking victims who are foreign nationals are not always undocumented or do not always come in using false documents. Many enter the U.S. with valid visas and end up in situations of slavery. There have been trafficking victims who came to the U.S. on a K-1 or fiancé visa, on temporary worker visas such as the H-1B, the H-2A, or H-2B visas, on student or exchange program visas such as the J-1 or F-1 visa, and others such as religious worker visas, international organization worker staff visas, and the like. In the case of David versus Signal International, workers from India were recruited under the H-2B working visa process to work at Signal's shipyards in Mississippi and Texas. The workers each paid the labor recruiters and a lawyer between $10,000 and $20,000 in recruitment fees and other costs after the recruiters promised good jobs, green cards, and permanent U.S. residency for them and their families. So most sold property or plunged their families deeply into debt to pay these fees. And once they arrived, they saw that it was all a lie. They were abused and mistreated, made to sleep in cramped, heavily guarded quarters, and were not allowed to leave the work premises. They faced disparagement because of their nationality. And they were stuck because those who tried to complain were detained with threats of deportation. The multitude of industries where trafficking has happened can exist anywhere in the USA. It happens not only in illegitimate industries or sex industries, but also in legitimate industries. In Illinois, for instance, sex trafficking has been found in hotels, residential brothels, escort services, and in some restaurants, and through the internet. Labor trafficking has occurred in domestic work, in factories, massage parlors, the restaurant industry as well, and agriculture. This is a heat map from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center showing the hotspots for calls to the trafficking hotline. The trafficking hotline was established in 2007, and the darker areas show where more calls were received compared to other places. In 2015, there were 555 calls in Illinois. 233 of those calls referred to victims who exhibited high indicators, and 100 exhibited moderate indicators of trafficking. In the aggregate, from 2000 to 2015, the hotline received 3,083 calls in Illinois, with 724 victims exhibiting high indicators and 720 exhibiting moderate indicators. The hotline relies greatly on concerned citizens. The number one source of tips are community members, or some call it Good Samaritans. The second source of tips are trafficking victims. And other sources for tips are nonprofits and victims of other crimes, among others. As for human trafficking indicators, trafficking is considered a hidden crime because it happens in both legitimate and illegitimate industries, and victims oftentimes do not self-identify as victims. Also, the trafficker's power and control is not always easy to uncover. But the methods of power and control can manifest on a victim in various ways, and we can help detect by looking closer through the use of trafficking indicators. These indicators of trafficking can be grouped into three general categories: the physical indicators, the surrounding circumstances, and the psychological indicators. First, here are some physical indicators. A trafficking victim can be malnourished, have serious dental issues, have bruises, scars, or signs of physical abuse or torture, such as improperly healed wounds. They may have workplace injury or may be in chronic pain. Some may also have branding tattoos showing the name or symbol of their controller. This reflects what the primary objective of a trafficker is. It's really economic gain, with the victims being tools to make money who should keep working until they cannot due to disability or a physical ailment that impedes the work. A nationwide trend is that gangs are changing their motives from drug to sex trafficking, which is more lucrative because one victim can generate money every day and is not a one-time source of revenue. Second, check the surrounding circumstances. Is there an indication of limited freedom, such as high security measures in the work or living locations? They're not free to come or go as they please. Is there a lack of control over their personal possessions? Are they in control of their money, records, or bank account? Do they owe a large debt, which they're unable to pay off? Are they not in control of their own identification documents? Are they able to speak for themselves? Someone else is always speaking in their behalf for various supposed reasons such as being too young or not being able to speak the language or being unable to articulate themselves efficiently. Lastly, the work conditions. As long as they're under 18 and providing commercial sex acts, that could be an indication of trafficking. Are they in the commercial sex industry and have a pimp or manager? Do they work excessively long and unusual hours? Are they allowed breaks or do they suffer unusual restrictions at work? Were they recruited through false promises regarding the nature and conditions of the work? And are they paid, unpaid, or paid very little or only through tips? Third, the psychological or mental indicators of trafficking are anxiety, hopelessness, sleeplessness, exhaustion, depression, or fear of being alone. These indicators may show that a victim does not have sufficient rest days or works long hours, or maybe is not being given enough to eat. These may also reflect their constant fear due to threats by the controller that the victim will be deported or will be reported to the authorities. Hence, they may have a fear of authorities and they may avoid eye contact. Some trafficking victims are moved around from state to state, and not staying in one place helps erase traffickers' tracks, so victims may be disoriented or do not know where they are. Some are also made to memorize a story or forced to change their name or age to conceal the trafficking. The cycle of exploitation shows how trafficking can start from taking advantage of a victim's vulnerabilities to recruit or entrap the victim into the situation. It goes from there to the tension-building phase to full-blown trafficking, which comes back full circle through a reconciliation or recruitment phase again. This cycle is enabled by barriers that make it difficult to leave, such as a fear of the trafficker, shame that this has happened to the victim, hope that things will get better, despair that they cannot leave, isolation, or even love or affection for the trafficker, and even culture, ranging from cultural expectations to cultural taboos. Now, trafficking often intersects or overlaps with other crimes or abuse or issues. For instance, trafficking victims may also be domestic violence victims. Domestic violence is a push and pull factor for trafficking. For service providers, it is important to know whether a client may be a trafficking survivor as well. Because if you have a client who may be a domestic violence victim, and later on you realize that they may also be a trafficking victim, having other legal remedies and social services available in both issues is a plus and helps expand the options to help the client move along with their lives. Secondly, DV advocates are best equipped to handle the needs of the client in terms of providing trauma-informed, victim-centric care and services. And lastly, many human trafficking survivors actually seek help in domestic violence shelters or with domestic violence service providers. If we are able to identify the other issues that underlie a client's current situation, we are able to identify the unique needs that are not necessarily covered by the current need that they present at hand. That's why DV shelters and organizations are increasingly being asked to help reach out to these survivors and help identify whether there might be other issues other than domestic violence that is going on. And one of the ways to effectively reach out is to adjust our intake tools to insert questions that may help screen for other issues such as trafficking. So this is one of the various ways domestic violence can intersect with trafficking. Here, it starts out as a romantic relationship, which escalates into domestic violence, but eventually the man forces the woman into a commercial sex act with him receiving the payment. His use of their intimate relationship to force her into providing a commercial sex act is evident. The physical assault was a way to ensure power and control. This is another possible domestic violence situation. Illinois law defines domestic violence to include physical abuse or harassment committed against someone who currently or previously lives or works in the same dwelling as the abuser. Harassment refers to conduct that is not necessary to accomplish a purpose and causes emotional distress to a reasonable person. Threatening physical force, confinement, or restraint is an example of harassment. So in this scenario, there are indicators that show it may be a case of labor trafficking. If we look at where the domestic worker sleeps and how much work she's forced to do and how she's subject to verbal and psychological abuse, which is evident with the use of a toothbrush to clean the floor, there are enough indicators here to show a possible trafficking case that overlaps with domestic violence. So questions need to be asked because trafficking survivors rarely self-identify due to fear or a lack of knowledge about the help that's available. And that's where service providers play a key role in identification and referral. Here's the last scenario. What are the indicators of labor trafficking in this scenario? So 1, there is confiscation of passports. 2, look at the number of beds in the room that may reflect substandard housing conditions. 3, the worker is made to work long hours and even in inclement weather. And 4, he is unable to take sufficient rest despite being sick. Any of the indicators on its own, although proof of labor exploitation, may not be enough to show a trafficking situation. However, lumping all the indicators together, again, just like the spectrum in the previous slide from the Urban Institute study, there might be enough indicators to warrant a further review of the work situation to show that there might be a case of labor trafficking. So for instance, a case some years ago happened at a New York State fair. Some workers from Mexico were brought on H-2B temporary visas to help sell food at the food stall. They were promised pay of $10 an hour, but were paid only $1 an hour. They were made to work 16 to 18-hour days for 2 weeks, and on the 12th day they worked 24 hours. They weren't fed. They begged for food from people. They were made to share beds infested with bed bugs, and the workers eventually got sick and filled with bites but were still forced to work. The employer allowed one worker to go to the fair's health center only after the bites were all over the worker's hands and feet, rendering him incapable to do the work. But the health center worker saw enough indicators through the intake and through the questions asked and determined that this is a serious situation, not just a case of bug bites and not just a case of dehydration, that he should be connected with both a major hospital and number 2, with a workers' nonprofit group who can help him escape his situation. So the workers were connected and they were helped by the nonprofit group to report stolen wages to the Department of Labor, where the investigators found that because of all the circumstances, it was not just an issue of wage theft, but trafficking, thanks to that one healthcare worker who saw that there were indicators here that warranted a referral, not just to the hospital, but to a workers' nonprofit group as well. The Stages of Change model helps us visualize the steps a survivor needs to go through to achieve freedom from a trafficking situation. Sometimes trafficking survivors do not self-identify because they are in the pre-contemplation stage. Either they're not thinking about change or reject the idea of leaving. But with help from someone like a support person, the seed is planted and they can get to contemplate about perhaps leaving. And then with support and a clearer understanding of what can happen, a survivor can seek even more support to help prepare for this change and finally take action by taking positive steps. Victims tend to stay in the trafficking situation because they do not think there is help available to them, or they are resigned to the idea that this is their fate or this is as good as it gets. Some may have Stockholm Syndrome or express sympathy and have positive feelings toward their controllers. With your help, a potential survivor can move from pre-contemplation and achieve all the steps to make it to maintenance or stable behavior. Take note, though, that you may also encounter clients who are beyond pre-contemplation and may be at various stages of this model. So, what can you do as a service provider? Number one, ask key questions that can help determine if your client may be a trafficking victim. Consider integrating a few key questions at intake and then more in-depth follow-up questions during subsequent meetings after rapport has been established. Some sample initial key questions could be something along the lines of, did anyone make you feel scared or unsafe or threatened to hurt you in the home or workplace? Or have you ever worked or done any activity without getting the payment you thought you would get? A good way to help formulate questions and find an effective way to integrate this at intake is to check the Vera Institute Human Trafficking Screening Toolkit. This toolkit is available online at www.vera.org in both English and Spanish. The toolkit has a short version that is only 3.5 pages long from page 25 onwards and is an easy addition to any intake assessment your organization may already have. Number 2, consider the following when you decide to intervene or you decide for disclosure. Use trauma-informed care to establish trust, to ask what happened, not what's wrong with you, and to mirror the terms the client may use, such as the use of boyfriend or aunt referring to the controller or trafficker. Do a risk assessment. If the client is in imminent harm or danger, follow your organization's safety protocols and contact law enforcement. Does the mandated reporter process kick in for you? Namely, is the client under 18? Is the client someone who should be provided adult protective services or the like? So based on your reporting protocol, follow the mandated reporter process. If you do not have one in your organization, there are some suggested reporting protocols under the website traffingresourcecenter.org, which is connected with the National Human Trafficking Center hotline. And lastly, consider the immediate needs of the survivor. Connect them with known local social services or with the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline to know the local resources or to seek help. Knowing what help is out there may help persuade potential victims to get out of their situation. And so lastly, knowing the remedies available to trafficking survivors is another way you can help as a service provider. Number 1, for non-US citizens, there is immigration relief through humanitarian visas, such as a T visa, which is specifically for trafficking victims, and the U visa, which is for victims of crime, including human trafficking. For both US and non-US citizens, a petition can be filed to vacate and expunge criminal records of prostitution due to sex trafficking. Both labor and sex trafficking victims can also seek restitution, which is the payment for damages due to the harm caused by the trafficking, through either criminal or civil cases. And also, case management services are available for free, where victims are helped by case managers so that they can receive benefits and services to repair the harm caused by the trafficking situation. And as each victim's experience is unique and surrounding circumstances is unique, these needs can be varied and can range from housing, healthcare, public benefits, employment, childcare, even applying for driver's licenses or looking for English as a second language lesson. Any kind of need that is required in order to help the victim move from victim to survivor and restore their lives. Lastly, know that the human trafficking hotline is available 24/7, is confidential, is toll-free, and interpreters are available for free for over 200 languages. The hotline will help you assess whether you may have encountered a victim of human trafficking, to help identify local community resources that can help the victims, and coordinate with local social service organizations, again, to help protect and serve victims so they can begin the process of restoring their lives. You can also report online at traffickingresourcecenter.org. However, please do remember, if the victim is at risk for imminent harm, call 911. Here are some organizations providing free services in Chicago and Illinois to victims of both labor and sex trafficking. For legal services, the National Immigrant Justice Center is available statewide and may be reached at 312-660-1370. LAF is also available statewide and may be reached at 312-341-1070. For comprehensive social services, the Salvation Army Stop It program is available to those located in Cook County and the Northern District and may be reached at 1-877-606-3158. Heartland Human Care Services is available statewide and may be reached at 312-662-6185. And lastly, our program through the Human Trafficking Initiative and the Victim Legal Assistance Network provides both legal services and social services to victims who can travel to any of our centers or offices in the Cook County and surrounding suburbs. And we may be reached at 312-986-4200, which is our legal intake line. Again, if the potential victim is outside of the Chicago or Illinois area, please contact the National Human Trafficking Resource Center at 1-888-3737-888. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you, and email us at trafficking@metrofamily.org for any questions, comments, or technical assistance, or even to request trafficking outreach materials. We have outreach cards available in over a dozen languages. Thanks for watching.